Hey guys, hope y'all are doing well. Again, we are continuing in our study in Jonah. And the first verse I want to look at today is Jonah chapter 1, verse 11. It says, "So they said to him, 'What should we do to you that the sea may become calm for us?' For the sea was becoming increasingly stormy." So the question hangs in the air after a mistake or problem. It swims through your minds when circumstances go haywire or when you fall into a horrid consequence of rebellion. We must ask, while we navigate this interrupted life, what should we do? The storm raged around the sailors, threatening to break up the ship. These men needed answers, and since Jonah clearly told them he was running from God, they were sure that this storm was no simple act of nature. It had theological implications and was a deliberate act of Jonah's God. They wanted desperately to know, as often as we do, how to navigate a life in turmoil. We easily become paralyzed by fear or guilt when our lives seems to whirl out of control. A glimpse of our lives with all of their spinning parts can make us dizzy with disgust at the mess that we may have made. It's easier to just sit, soak, and be sour. That's what the enemy would like us to do. He'd prefer we get lazy, complacent, and apathetic with distance between ourselves and God's best. But if, like the sailors, we see the connection between our chaotic circumstances and our own decisions, we must ask, now what? So, maybe you're not currently in Jonah's position. And I pray that you're not. Hopefully, you've had a divine intervention and have chosen to yield to it. So you aren't in a state of rebellion against God's direction. So if Jonah's situation doesn't apply to you, please stay with me today. Today promises an important reminder of the redemptive truth of God's grace that mercifully rescues us anytime, any place, and in any situation. See, Jonah's answers to the sailors' questions and actions give us a shadow of 4 significant New Testament principles for reconciling with God. And these 4 that we need to know are acknowledge our sin. That's the first one. The second one, accept God's discipline. The third one, ask for forgiveness. And the fourth one is act on God's direction. Note that Jonah did not appear truly repentant for his actions. We'll see that as we continue in this study. We'll see that in chapter 4. In chapter 4, he still didn't want God's mercy poured out on the Ninevites. However, his prayer in chapter 2 does suggest that he realized the brutality of running from God. While Jonah may not have fully recognized the gravity of his disobedience, he was penitent. We can learn some crucial lessons through his story about true repentance and its effect on us. First, we see in Jonah chapter 1, verse 12, that Jonah acknowledged his sin. That is the first step. The second step we see in Jonah chapter 1, verse 15. He accepted the discipline. In Jonah chapter 2, verse 2, he asked for forgiveness. And in Jonah chapter 2, verse 9, and chapter 3, verse 3, he act on God's direction. So these 4 principles, I want to go over each one, okay? So principle number 1, don't play the blame game. Jonah's response to the sailors' questions in verse 11 illustrates the first move out of rebellion and back into the arms of God. We see in Jonah chapter 1, verse 11 and 12, it says, "Then they said to him, 'What shall we do to you that the sea may become calm for us?' For the sea was growing more tempestuous. And he said to them, 'Pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will become calm for you. For I know that this great tempest is because of me.'" See, I can't help but think about the change in Jonah's path from a road of rebellion to a pathway of penance. And it began long before he sat in a waterlogged belly of a fish. In fact, it began even before he was tossed overboard. Jonah didn't answer all of the questions, but the truth of those answers most likely swam around in his heart and head. The reality of who he was and what he was doing must have felt like a searing weight on his rebellious conscience. As Jonah responded to the questions of the frightened sailors, he simply stated that he was a Hebrew. He chose the word commonly used to distinguish the people of God from those of other nations. In fact, Gentiles would often use the term Hebrew as a way of differentiating between themselves and those who served Yahweh and were beneficiaries of a covenant relationship. No doubt, just the name reminded Jonah of the gravity of his unique connection with the one true God. The ministry of God's Spirit evidently washed over Jonah. His heart was overwhelmed with conviction, and he proceeded to spill out the laundry list of adjectives to describe the God who governed his people and who governed him. With the storm still raging on the sea, another storm raged in the prophet. With each word of truth, his heart was pierced. His journey back home to right relationship with God and his will had began. Isaiah chapter 30, verse 21 says, "Your ears will hear a word behind you. This is the way, walk in it, whether you turn to the left or the right." So God's Spirit is a master at asking questions. He has a way of challenging us to consider where we've been, what we've done, and how we plan to make right anything that we may be doing wrong. Our journey back to the Lord begins when we take time to consider and accept the conviction He uses to stir us and wake us to new direction that He wants for us. Even if we are not in a season of known rebellion like Jonah was, it is always in our best interest to pray like the psalmist prayed. "Search me, O God. Know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you and lead me along the path of everlasting life." And that is Psalms chapter 139, verses 23 and 24. And that is a verse that I have on a sticky note and I have here at my desk. I don't know if you all know that about me or not, but I have sticky notes posted everywhere. And this is a verse that I pray about myself. And I encourage you to put put verses on sticky notes too and stick them everywhere, just as I do. I mean, that's just something that I do. It's a good reminder to help keep our minds right, or my mind right anyway. But anyway, back to the lesson. Okay, Jonah chapter 1 verse 15, it says, "So they picked up Jonah and threw him into the sea, and the sea stopped its raging." So the second principle is accept the discipline, okay? And this was Jonah's discipline. By the time the sailors got around to tossing Jonah overboard, they had become pretty used to hurling our items over into the sea. They'd most likely already thrown precious metals, horses, mules, ivory, various other products into the Mediterranean. I'm amazed that Jonah so easily allowed the sailors to throw him into the fierce waves also. But since Jonah advised them to throw him overboard and there was no evidence to suggest a struggle, it appears that he did not fight the correction God allowed. He learned what he already knew deep down, that he could not escape God. Now he gave all of himself over to what the Lord was permitting. Finally, the prophet held nothing back, including his own body, and surrendered completely. God now had what he wanted in the first place: the prophet's willingness to obey. The fish become the way to preserve Jonah for the future ministry that God had for him. And we read in Psalms chapter 119, verses 71 and 75, it says, "It is good for me that I was afflicted, that I may learn your statutes. I know, O Lord, that your judgments are righteous, and that in faithfulness you have afflicted me." See, God allows reproof and correction as a sign of his love for us and his intent to use us. Divine discipline, reproof, and correction indicates that we have a relationship with him. Make no mistake about it, his discipline has a method and specific design. His goal is to revive so he can realign. Jonah's heart needed a realignment. While God desired to dispense mercy to the Ninevites, Jonah wanted them demolished. His aspirations were not in sync with God's. The discipline God allowed was not meant to punish Jonah. It was meant to prepare him. Accepting and surrendering to divine discipline was in Jonah's best interest. Okay, and here's a key thing to remember. A behavioral change, but not a heart change, is only a temporary change. But a heart change plus a behavioral change makes a permanent change. See, God's goal for us is that we mature into spiritual adults who have tender hearts that mirror his. He doesn't discipline for fun or for sport. He does so to prepare us for what he has in store for us. God still wanted to use Jonah, and he still wants to use us. In fact, look at the great lengths God took to preserve Jonah and give him an opportunity to participate in his purposes. He hurdled a wind and a storm so fierce they almost destroyed the ship. He gave the sailors no other option but to toss Jonah overboard. Then God prepared a fish that would come by just at the right time to swallow him whole and keep him from drowning. God's discipline was centered around the care of his beloved prophet, And his discipline in our lives is no different. Knowing this should cause us to be more willing to yield to the discomfort of discipline that he allows. God's discipline had certainly began when Jonah found himself in the belly of the fish. He did something that he had not done since he left Israel. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the stomach of the fish, and that is Jonah chapter 2, verse 1. Jonah prayed. He talked to God. Open communication is one of the first signs of a heart being molded by God. See, God has given his children so many new things to get excited about. His Spirit lives inside of you. And divine opportunities beckon you to complete your purpose. Along the way, you may be tempted to store old habits, preferences, hindrances, and sins just in case. Why would you or I hold on to anything old when the new has come? We see that in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17. The old might be comfortable, but it's not useful. Today is the day for us to confess and move on. See, Jonah had a problem letting go. Initially, he wanted to keep his own goals and hesitated to fully embrace God's task for him. Now we see a different side of the freshly disciplined prophet. He survived a fierce storm and a brush with death. Now in the belly of a fish, Jonah thought twice about the things he had been holding on to and the decisions he had made. He decided it was time to, once and for all, to come clean and let go. Okay, so far we've went over 2 of the 4 principles, and I don't want to make this video too long, so I will stop here. The first one we went over is acknowledge your sin, and the second one is accept discipline. So I don't want to make this video too long for you. I know you all like the shorter videos, so I will stop here and we will go over the other 2 tomorrow in another video, okay? So remember, acknowledge your sin, accept discipline. That's the first 2. Get you a notebook and jot these down. They're very important. And we'll go over the other 2 in the next video. I want to say I love you guys. Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Like, share, and subscribe. Join me on the Disciple server. And if I don't see you in the next video, I hope to see you in heaven. Bye, guys.